excited to talk with you all today about some of the interesting opportunities in the education space. McKinsey anticipated in 2017 1.2 billion people that are currently employed around the world are working in automatable jobs. This doesn't mean all these people are going to lose their jobs. A lot of them have to be reskilled. There's also implications for the education sectors as automation changes the way we work and live. And there's opportunities for the entertainment sector about how we fill people's time and how we re-educate them to do these things. So today on the panel, we're going to explore those issues. I'm joined by Dino Varkey, who is GEM's Education Chief Executive Officer, and also working in a bunch of different adult education spaces. We have Alex Spiro, who's partner at Brighteye, which is a venture capitalist fund in Europe, working in ed tech space. And we have the amazing Deborah Quazzo, who is a managing partner at GSV Ventures, working in the education technology and future workforce space. And so I'm going to start off by asking all of you the same question, which is, I would love for you each to share a bit about how you recommend we invest in the increased years of learning that's required now that the automation economy has arrived. And Dino, maybe we can start with you, since your model is both brick and mortar and online.
So, I mean, look, I think whenever you think about scaling, we like to think of a few fundamentals. I think you need passion. I think you need purpose. Of course, you need capital. When we think about the future as it sits, and I remember when I started working 15 years ago, I remember speaking to my father. I said, look, how do I get a sense of what the opportunity is across our sector? He told me to go read Merrill Lynch's Book of Knowledge, Merrill Lynch at the time. So that valued the global education sector opportunity at just around $2 trillion. Today, by all accounts, we're just under $7 trillion. Yep. I think what's incredibly apparent to us is that the traditional models of funding education have historically sat with governments. Most mature hemisphere, sort of markets and countries have got a government-funded model. And given the scale of the challenge that we're trying to address, but also the scale of the opportunity that we're trying to address, you absolutely need to find different forms of investment cycles, capital providers that want to tackle what we believe is potentially the most important thing that we can address, and that is kind of the future of learning, the future of education across our planet.
Okay, Alex?
I mean, from my perspective, so we sort of sit in Paris and London. We really look at the European education sector. There are so many challenges with upskilling and reskilling in Europe alone. So there are going to be 750,000 jobs in Europe that won't be filled in 2020 because the population lacks the adequate skills to go into the ICT sector. And so there when you talk about scale, we look at obviously all areas of the value chain in the education sort of economy, but when you look at corporates, you see a very immediate need. So whether it's sort of the proliferation of third-generation boot camps or tech training solutions, whether they're online or blended, or you look at sort of on-the-job, just-in-time training that's in some cases powered by automation. There's such a large opportunity in corporates that I think you can build huge businesses in Europe just on that alone. Obviously, that's before you get to the challenges of how to help the existing educational institutions provide the right experiences, the right learning, the right frameworks for students to grow into those roles from an early stage. And that's more of a challenge, but I think we're getting to the point where digital penetration, broadband device penetration in schools being funded by governments in Europe, but also increasingly being adopted on the private side, which is also growing in Europe. I think we can start to meet those challenges pretty soon.
Okay.
Yeah, great. I think it's not only automation. It's actually this sort of it's automation overlaid with the concept of the 100-year life. I think the fact that longevity is increasing, for all of our lives. My grandma made it to 102, so I've got the genes to do it. I'll be there. And I think that it's a fascinating thing for my own children to have them think about. When I grew up, it was a 16-year curriculum. You did pre-K, 16 through college, and that's what you needed. And you as you filled up your gas tank, as we like to say at GSV, and you went off into the world, and that's all you needed. And now there's a movement towards thinking about a 60-year curriculum. There's actually been some great academic work done around this topic, both in the U.S. and the U.K. actually, and people need to rethink whether they need to be rushing themselves into the college experience. Are there other gap year experiences? Are there other things they ought to be doing to actually extend themselves and extend their educational experience? And people also need to be, I think, have come to embrace, not everyone, but have come to embrace the fact that lifelong learning is here to stay. It was something we kind of all said for, just for lip service. I would say 10 years ago, it was something everybody loved to pretend like they believed in, but nobody really did. But I think we've actually hit a place where lifelong learning is going to be essential for you to survive and to be able to retool yourself to be economically relevant, as we like to say, so that all people can have equal access to the future. So I think there's also this phenomenon of corporations becoming the fourth education system in the world. We have pre-K, we have K-12, higher education and workforce, and companies who are, in many cases, are ingesting the failures of downstream systems, certainly in the U.S., in the K-12 and higher education systems, where we're really only, our students, only about a third of our high school students are really coming out of high school capable, college ready, and capable of doing math and reading and comprehension at a high level. So companies are having to absorb these issues in order to fill their seats. So I think it's in the words of Chicago's Mayor Rahm Emanuel, where I'm from, don't ever fritter away a crisis. I think we have a crisis, and I think the good news is we're seeing some great reactions from universities and from the workplace, and I think that's creating some really interesting longitudinal focus on lifelong learning.
Okay, great, thank you. Building on that, Alex, could you share with us some of the unique things about scaling ed tech in Europe versus the US markets?
Yeah, so I mean, the challenge in Europe is that versus the US, obviously the US, you have a homogenous culture, you have, for the most part, one or two languages, and obviously it's a federation of states, so you can scale very quickly, very rapidly, and build market share. If you have a great product, you have great sales very quickly. In Europe, you have 28 member states. You have many different languages, many different sort of cultures, and so it's a very fragmented region. So the challenges really in Europe are sort of how do you overcome that and build businesses of a certain scale. So, I mean, it really depends on what the business is. That's the first thing I would say. So, for instance, in the UK, there is a huge issue with teacher supply. They can't train teachers fast enough. And so there's a huge liquidity issue. So for example, we invested in a company that just focuses on that problem, and that problem alone is a 1.3 billion pound a year problem. So if they get any market share solving that problem, then that can be a very large business. When you're talking about kind of very light touch sort of products and services, then you need to go for sort of organizations that already have scale, which is why I was talking about corporates, because there you have, the CAC 40 in France, for instance. You have very large corporations, obviously, with their seats in Amsterdam and London. And so if you can go through corporate learning and development departments, you can also get to scale very quickly by providing solutions and services that are enabled by technology. So I think really the answer is twofold. It's focusing on infrastructural sort of inherent problems with the system, with solutions that are scalable just by virtue of them being infrastructure plays, and then on the other hand, with the more sort of service-based sort of light touch products, perhaps you would need to focus on kind of the markets that are already fairly well versed. And just to give you one example, in France, last year they spent 25 billion euros on corporate education. So it's a pretty huge market if you can bite off even a little chunk of it.
Okay. Deborah, did you want to add on that regarding the U.S. market? Are there key trends or disruptions?
Well, I was going to say it's interesting. I mean, you think about geography, and Dino probably, Jim's has been out there for many, many moons, driving, education, K-12 and elsewhere. I think the scaling issue for education is not geographically limited. I think education until the last decade has been a category that's been very difficult to scale, period. Doesn't matter what your local, and we all have local permutations of that issue. But I think in general, it really has only been in the last decade. We have a phrase we use at GSV called weapons of mass instruction. It was not possible prior to the last decade to begin to address educational delivery against millions of people. And today, companies like Coursera have, roughly 50 million learners on their platform at any one time. And that was something that was completely unheard of, whether you were based in Europe or you were based in the Middle East or you were based in the US. So I think there have been just some fundamental things that have changed. Obviously, the internet, the driving down the cost of access, et cetera. But that kicked off a much better decade for education in terms of being able to achieve scale that are above the limitations of local geographies that have allowed real scale to be achieved in all of our geographies, actually, depending on the business model.
I mean, the only thing I'd add there is I think we were speaking to this in the speaker room earlier on. I think one of the things that's been very beneficial for certainly emerging markets has been the fact that we have not historically had the benefit of a social welfare system. Lots of Western hemispheres, the US and the UK and others, have had the benefit of a social welfare system. Performance of the system aside, a public education system, a public healthcare system. Here, because of the absence of that, you've essentially had private sector needing to, out of necessity, create products and or services that met the needs of its customers. And in parts like here, it was for families that were crying out for a higher quality of education than they had access to. So I think that was a real enabler, and I think it's something that certainly we see in this part of the world. You've got governments and leadership that is very, very focused on developing human capital, and unlike many other markets that we tend to see, typically more mature markets where education, as we were saying, is a social or a political football, they're actually trying to create an enabling environment. And I think when we think about scaling an education solution, all of the actors need to come together to figure out what is the best environment that they can create in order to enable exponential access to quality education.
And then in the context of GEMS, you've really emphasized the quality of education as well, right? Not just the access. So could you share with us a little bit some of the key trends you see in teacher training and that important side of the development?
Yeah, I mean, look, we've believed for a long time that actually if we're going to address education, we call it a crisis, but if you're going to address the 1.2 billion young people that frankly have access to no education or a very poor quality of education, then the best way is to try and build teacher capability and capacity globally. So I think that's been our underlying thesis. But if you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, which reframed access to education to access to quality education, the global teacher shortage has gone from 8 million to about 70 million. So when we think about that as the global shortage, then you start to think that, okay, traditional solutions may not overcome that kind of a shortage. And that's where I think technology has a role to play. You inevitably ask questions such as, how do we get a great teacher across greater numbers of students? Because they're a diminishing resource. You start to say, who or what qualifies as a great teacher? Because the reality is we teach in all of our lives, each and every day. We learn from our peers, from mentors, from anybody. We learn each and every day. So I think one of the things that, when we applied to certainly sort of teacher training, what are we seeing? One, through TELAL, which is our teacher training institute, we're seeing increasing numbers of professionals come to us in order to get a teacher training certification. So we're able to give them an international teacher qualification in a year. So they may have been a marketeer. They might have been an engineer, but actually they want to come into the teaching profession. And perversely, when we think about how much the labor markets are going to be disrupted, the fact that there is an opportunity for people to migrate to, an ascending theme, where the scale of the challenge sort of is accelerating away from us, that's interesting. So sector specialists that have lost their jobs because of automation or some form of sort of technological disruption, having a space within teaching. So we're seeing that. We're seeing the actual modality of teacher training change. So we run apprenticeship programs where we actually take trainee teachers and they do their training in the classroom. rather than in a remote setting. Where we can't get our teachers or our trainees into the classroom, we now use simulations and avatar-based training. So imagine a trainee teacher, you've got a virtual classroom, you've got the trainers that are simulating different kinds of behavior within a classroom. And then that's how they learn. And finally, content, right? I think what our teachers learn, I mean, look, if our teachers are meant to be the stewards of future generations in an era where change is going to be unprecedented, then frankly, what they are taught to teach needs to change. So, I mean, one of the things that we're really excited about is we're working with IBM to implement their digital nation curriculum. Now, essentially, that is 72 courses across 8 big themes, 240 hours of learning. But they're essentially going to train our teachers in everything from AI to blockchain to quantum to Internet of Things to data science and so on. So the actual content of what our teachers need to learn is different, because our future is going to be different, and the future for our children is going to be different.
Absolutely. So you're alluding to the challenge that many of us face in the room, which is that there's a glut of the right kind of talent. And Deborah, in some of our conversations, you said that there are some winners and some losers already in this talent war. And I wonder if you'll share with us some of the countries that you think are winning this talent war and why. Is it a corporate commitment to lifelong learning, or is it the education system? What do you think is driving that?
Well, we've spent a lot of time in China over the last couple of years, and I think it undoubtedly the Chinese, a combination of top-down and bottoms-up. You have a parent base in China that desperately wants their children to be high-achieving and to, not just the Gaokao, but it's everything in between in terms of assessment and then being successful at work. And then you have the government, which has strongly embraced reforms, the implementation, the teaching of AI, the implementation of AI, and developing a more adaptive and personalized learning platform. So I think that if you want to see where some of the best innovations happening in education today, in education technology today, undoubtedly the first stop you would take is China. They've kind of gone from the imitator to the leader, and where others are now imitating what they can do. And the interesting thing about China, as we all know, is they're big, so they don't really have a need to ever export what they're good at. So they can actually keep all of their innovations in-house, as it were, and never feel, unlike the U.S. market or any other market, that in order to grow, you really need to be at some point exporting your expertise into other markets. That is really not the case in China. So I think the risk is that there is a tremendous amount of innovation that happens in the Chinese education technology market that the rest of the world never sees, because there's no need for them to those innovators and entrepreneurs and whatever company executives to actually export that out. So it's pretty fascinating, the pace at which they are innovating around applications of AI to augment teaching. I mean, to your point, Dino, it's they have lots of companies that are scaling rapidly around augmented teaching with artificial intelligence, because they have a real need to reach rural areas and remote areas and will never have the teaching. They can't possibly train enough teachers to get there. Same thing in their higher education institutions. So I think China hands down is ahead in terms of education innovation, and then you see countries like Singapore and Finland and others that are quite excellent education systems. I just think China is distinctively there on the tech utilization of tech.
Interesting. Okay, and as our time wraps up here, I wonder if you could each comment on what is the opportunity for industry to partner with higher education in these spaces? Is it scaling access to quality education? Is it research on technologies? Is it helping to incubate startups? How do you see potential partnerships in this space, or do you not?
So, I can speak to, while I can't comment on sort of industry partnerships with higher ed, and we were talking to it earlier on, we've started to spend a lot of time with industry, partnering to essentially deliver industry-relevant experience to 14 to 18-year-olds. So we've set up relationships with Siemens, to Microsoft, to Google, to IBM, and others, to essentially create these experiences for our young people, because actually that's what we think is relevant. I think even if one of my biggest frustrations when I actually look at the curriculum that our children need to do, are forced to do, are mandated to do, how much of that is truly relevant? And that's a different conversation about vested interests and control systems, so I won't get into that. But for us, industry is keen, because actually from an industry perspective, it is about talent, right? When you were having to spend years, in certain cases, undoing what a lot of higher ed has done, or a lot of education has done, let me not put it on higher ed, a lot of what education's done, that simply isn't efficient. It is an incredible waste of dollars. Mm-hmm. So I think you're starting to see that willingness much, much earlier from industry, certainly as far as K-12 is concerned.
I mean, from my perspective, I think universities will always have a crucial role to play. I do believe that, because there are certain universities that have so much cachet and really where, you know, the brand alone, you know, leveraged in the right way, can continue to deliver great experiences and also to provide links to industry. But I do see the emergence of sort of new generation institutions that sort of step beside the higher education institutions of the past and say, what skills do the corporates need? How can we train them not just before but during and on an ongoing basis within corporations, so that they don't become redundant as automation increases? Fundamentally, an engaged workforce is the only thing that can ensure social cohesion and the proliferation of democracy, of participation, of civil participation, and so you can't not address the issue. You have to address the issue, and increasingly, it's the case that if you don't address it vis-a-vis the industry, then you're going to have people out of jobs with idle thumbs, really, honestly, not being productive members of society, and there are plenty of jobs, as I said earlier, that are out there for everyone, and it's not. You don't need to have been studying engineering from age 2 in order to get the skills necessary to be productive today. You just need a little bit of help navigating this new economy, and I think there are lots of plays that can achieve that.
You know, I just quickly say that today there are about 220 million higher education students in the world. That's up from 160 million a decade ago, and in the next decade there will be 440 million higher education students in the world. Universities will have to address the education to employment pipeline, or they will find themselves completely and totally irrelevant. I actually think your brand won't matter at some point if you aren't really delivering students into the workforce. In the US already, well over half of the higher education population is no longer in that 18 to 22-year-old bracket, and yet most of our universities haven't really reacted and, you know, are still catering to dormitories and football teams and marching bands. So if we don't see some real quick, you know, people, we have a lot of innovators globally that are leading the way in terms of how they need to dramatically change. But I think part of that is this collaboration with industry, which is really essential, and I think it fits in with the theme that industry is now becoming the fourth education system. It really becomes a true collaboration, not just industry trying to stuff, you know, commercial interests down the throats of higher education. I think it's a true collaboration in bringing students forward so they can have access to future jobs.
Okay. Excellent. Well, we are out of time, but thank you guys for contributing not just to our futures, but to this panel. And thank you all for coming.
Thank you very much. Thank you.